that's my identity, that's who I am. Blah, 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 blah. You know, I park in 2 parking spaces so nobody scratches my car, right? Because I have a void. And so no matter how much stuff we put in, it never allows us to feel completed.
There's an expression, you can never get enough of what you really didn't want in the first place.
That's right. With money you didn't have.
Right.
To impress people you
don't know.
Right? So, no, so cars and money, those things are great in perspective, right? So, part of what we, and actually the body and the spirit should look like this. That's what it really should look like, right? But for the sake of my example, I did the Venn diagram. But, and so when we're able to get people to those places, that's when we can really help them be effective in being the drivers of their lives.
Part of what I'm hearing, Andre, is the current emphasis on mindfulness in the psychological and social science fields. There's so much talk about mindfulness, which is being in the now and being aware of your body, your spirit, and not being in the future. And it feels like that's kind of implied in a lot of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, yeah. I am a self-subscribed student of Parker Palmer. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Parker
I
Palmer.
sure am.
Please get his stuff if you have the opportunity. I was introduced to him through one of his first books. I'm not sure if it's the first, but Courage to Teach. And I was a young guy, and was given that as a gift and started really reaching that. And he has Hidden Wholeness is another one of his books. But he speaks a lot about how to engage the soul, right? I mean, because once we get that split, then all sorts of things and all sorts of behaviors come out of that. And so, yeah, so when we talk about those negative aspects of this safety, significance, and belonging, the card that I typically use is that behavior uniting the body and the spirit, or is it dividing the body and the spirit? And if it's dividing the body and the spirit, it is evil. And so when we talk about human mutilations, we talk about all that child, pornography, or sexual, impropriety with, human trafficking, all that kind of stuff. This is my litmus test. Is that behavior uniting the body and the spirit? If not, it is evil.
It's a very simple but useful construct.
I'm trying to be like Adler.
I keep thinking of a poster that one of my colleagues had back in the mid-70s. The poster said, "I am in some ways like all other human beings, and I am in some ways like certain other human beings, and I am in some ways like no other human being."
That's right.
There's an interesting way in which we are unique, but we're also part of a larger community.
Yeah. I found it very interesting that there's an entertainer, I'll call him, named Darren Brown, and he's in Great Britain. He does a lot of, he uses psychological experiments in his performances, and he does a lot of kind of group art kind of stuff using a lot of psychological experiences. And so to better understand some of his stuff, I've researched a number of the things he presents that I obviously didn't get taught in school, right? And so I researched this stuff and become a student. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting is that he came to this guy, I think his last name is Garrison, and he came up with the concept of kind of groupthink. And he does this experiment where he takes a jar of jelly beans and he asked people to just, with their eyes shut, write down a number of how many jelly beans they think is in the jar. And so he has one individual, so he asked the whole group, and they all go and they tally all of their answers. They come up with the
The
mean,
mean.
and then he, picks, one person gets the closest, so he pulls them out, and he asks them how they blah, 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 and they either got it right on or pretty close. But then he pulls the group's mean and finds out that the group actually is accurate. They have exactly the number that's in the jar. And so for me, what that says is that together, we're much more accurate in making decisions than we are as individuals. However, that process is not always adequate for the timing that things need to happen. So those were some of the observations that I've made. So I wanted to give you these pieces as a part of our conversation. And next time, I think I'm gonna bring some water and juice and snacks, because this just feels like we need snacks.
Andre,
So,
I
yeah.
overheard, I was listening to a conversation on Bill Moyer's program a few weeks back, and he was talking to an African-American educator from someplace in the South, I don't remember exactly where, and he said something that really captured my imagination. He said, we can't avoid racial distinctions, but racial conclusions are bogus. And I was thinking that even more broadly. We can't ignore the distinction between an obese person and a fit person, but we have to be very careful about drawing conclusions based on the distinctions we observe. The same thing about gender, about race, about evidence of poverty. Somebody's poorly dressed, somebody's well dressed. We can't avoid making those distinctions, but we're tempted to draw conclusions. And that's kind of where you started tonight with the stereotypes.
Yep. And not only drawing those conclusions, but placing value on what those conclusions
Oh,
mean.
yes,
Right?
yeah.
So, I'm African American, and I assume that you both are white or Caucasian, however you choose to identify. And those are differences that I know, and I should know those, because
Yeah.
it's important to know those.
And I think part of what he was talking, I'm sorry.
But the other part is, what those differences mean, what values I associate with those are totally almost irreverent. I mean, and not irreverent, but irrelevant to
Yeah.
how effective we are as human beings. And I can be wrong about those assumptions, or those can be detrimental to my overall health and welfare if I don't take those under my control, if I'm not aware of them, if I'm not mindful of those things. So, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I kind of lost where I was going with that. Distinctions, conclusions. I think, particularly if we're uncertain or fearful, then I think we're more inclined to evaluate distinctions into good, bad, above, below, better, worse.
Yep. And one of the things that I often talk about, and I don't get a chance to talk about it often, because a number of the folks that I'm having conversations with are in an entry level of some of these conversations. So the higher level of stuff, or talking about these things at a higher level, is not necessarily appropriate for those conversations. But I talk about, the differences in color. And there have been a number of experiments on the social upbringing of children and how race plays a role in that and all that kind of stuff. But I think typically we ask the wrong questions, and so we consistently get the wrong answers. And, so there's this doll test that Dr. Clark has done, and it's been done several times after that. And they have a white doll and a black doll, and they started out by just asking black children, which is the good doll. And for the most part, they kept saying that the white doll was the best doll, and that the bad doll was the was the black doll was the bad doll. About 2 years ago, CNN did it with a number of different children. And the astonishing thing is they got the same results, or similar results. There were a few kids who had obviously had these kind of conversations and were sophisticated enough to have, their parents expose them in such a way that they had different answers. So they would say everybody's the same, blah, 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 but these were also pretty progressive parents. The other parents weren't regressive, they just were normal, regular parents, right? And so what struck me was how these kids were coming up with these same things over this long period of time. And so I started asking a different question. And I started asking what might be some alternatives to how the kids are coming up to these conclusions. And what occurred to me was looking back at our human adaptation to our modern world was that there was a time when we were not in buildings, where we were in small groups, and we were out in the wild among predators. And as predators, we suck, right? I mean, our claws are horrible,
Yeah.
our canines
We're
aren't that
not
great.
very well adapted, are we?
Right, we're not very well adapted. And so what that raised for me was this thought about what it might have been to be, one of these humans that was in a small group. And so I would imagine that nighttime for a small group of humans or an individual would be absolutely terrifying, right? To the point where I could not rest well at night. And I would imagine that stress would be relieved during the day. And so in my primal brain, I might make the distinction that nighttime is in fact a bad time, where daytime is great, right? Nightclubs, for some reason, they always seem to turn out the lights. It seems to be pretty dark in those places, right? Whereas when you go to, do business, banks are always well lit, right? And so what I came to was that this notion of light and dark is in our primal brains. It's part of our primal our primal way as humans we've learned to adapt to the environments in which we're in. But what has also happened is that we've carried over that primal instinct and started overlaying that on all sorts of institutions that have no relationship, or even individuals that have no relationship to my primal thinking. And so what I end up with is stuff like, if you have a very dark, rich chocolate cake, what is that referred to?
Oh, devil's food.
Devil's food cake, right? Dark chocolate cake. If I, at the same time, there's this light, fluffy, white, airy cake, which is called
Angel food.
Angel food cake, right? When women are to get married for the first time, they're supposed to wear a white dress. When you die, you're supposed to wear a black outfit and to represent the death. And so there are all of these things in our culture that start to creep up that I think that go back to that primal brain. And so when I see someone who is dark, my primal brain says bad. When I see someone who is light, my primal brain says good. Without even having to introduce those things into children's lives, I think part of that is because of that primal makeup. However, we can rise above those primal instincts, right? So we use the bathroom when we want to, not when our body says, we gotta go, right? Now, it may be a couple of minutes, it might, the time might be short, but we have control of that. When we have hunger, we don't just eat right then. We actually take time to prepare a meal or to go, sit down at a table and make those things happen, because we're more than our primal instinct. And I think when we talk about those racial distinctions, that is one of the things that's happening on top of all the other things that society has built in to either help people conform to those models or not.
One thing I read some time ago is that in every language, the word for tribe is the same as the people.
Mm.
So there's a sense in which we feel our kind and not our kind, our people and not our people. So I think there's a tendency to associate in like-minded ways and to be mistrusting of the not our kind. And I think that kind of tribalism, whatever you want to call it, just in your example, we have to be prepared and know that we can rise above those, I'm not familiar with this kind of a dance or this kind of dress or this kind of food, and to be wary of the differentness.
Yep. To recognize it,
Yeah.
but not necessarily apply negative value to it, because it is typically a different way of just trying to get what we're all trying to get. So I'm going to do an exercise with you that's on the back of your handout. And across the top are groups of individuals in our society, and along the side are people who have taught you about those groups across the top. And so what I'm curious is to, what did your parents and family teach you about these groups across the top? What did friends say? What did school and workplace say? What does TV and movies and media say about these groups? And what is personal experience? However, I want you to answer it in a particular kind of way. And we may have done this last time. Yes? Okay. What I'd like for you to do is to put a plus where you learn something positive, a minus where you learn something negative, or a 0 where you never had that conversation. All right? And for Thomas, we'll give him just a couple of minutes. So just as last time, what, as you were filling that out, were there any thoughts that came to your mind as you were filling that out?
For me, I feel fortunate that I grew up in northern Minnesota, that my parents were quite self-consciously not prejudiced, but open to, I think we had 2 African-American students in this whole school. But I felt that the atmosphere of respect was just what I grew up with. And we had Native Americans in our neighborhood, and my father went out of his way to be helpful helpful to them, and so I feel fortunate. But at the same time, no context growing up with Latinos or Asians. And with friends, I've put pluses all the way across. Just my social network is a very progressive, respectful network, as is school and workplace. Some of them were kind of hard to sort out, like movies and media. I don't know how I was affected by that. But it's an interesting exercise
Okay.
of awareness, which is the point.
Yeah, yeah. And for you, what were?
Well, I thought, my family too was very, just, everybody is, deserves your respect and your help and whatever. And my column that I had the most trouble with was TVs, movies, and what you're
Yeah.
exposed to.
Yeah, I
I mean, or not, or how people are portrayed or not, or included or not. And
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that the media really thrives off of this stuff, right? Including
Stereotypes, yeah.
stereotypes,
Mhm.
and or including or not including folks,
Mhm.
right? I mean, I think it was a long time before I actually saw a person with disabilities other than Canon. I don't know if you
Right,
remember that
yeah.
show, it was Ironside, I think it was,
Yes,
in a wheelchair.
An attorney, wasn't he?
Yes, he was an
Mhm.
attorney.
In a wheelchair,
In a
yeah,
wheel-
I think, yeah, I'd forgotten that, but that's about the only media example of someone handicapped in that way.
Yep. And I think the next time I saw someone, it was in the 80s, and there was a young man who had Down syndrome that was a part of this sitcom.
Oh, that's right.
Right. But other than that, I couldn't tell you of any folks with disabilities in the mass media.
Now we have an interesting example with this